Hello, Adult Sunday School Leader. Freedom. It's one of the cornerstones of our country, but you know there are so many in our land who are not free. They're in bondage to so many things. They're in bondage to sin, to chemicals of various kinds, to debt. But Jesus offers both grace, which is unmerited favor. It's that getting the good that we don't deserve. He offers grace and forgiveness that gives us freedom from whatever we're enslaved to. Grace and forgiveness. That's exactly what Jesus offered to the woman caught in adultery. And we're going to be looking at that this week as we continue in that series called My Encounter with Jesus. This is lesson number 3, called Jesus Gave Me Grace and Forgiveness. The focal passage is out of John chapter 8, verses 2 through 11. And the point is, Jesus took my guilt and set me free. Many years ago, I preached a sermon on this passage, and I believe the first time I preached it was around the 4th of July, so I entitled it, Finding Freedom in Forgiveness. Now, I've revised that sermon a bit, and I'm going to present that in this week's prep talk. So as we look at the first few verses in John chapter 8, verses 2 through the very first part of 6, we're taken to the temple courts. It was dawn. It was the start of a brand new day, and Jesus, the master teacher, he was there teaching the people who gathered around him. They were there to hear this Galilean, to hear him unfold the scriptures in a way that none of the other teachers of the law were able to do. Now, public opinion on him seemed to be split. Some thought he was the Christ, he was the Messiah, and he had been foretold for centuries. And others, they were a little confused, thinking he might be the Messiah, but they knew he was from Galilee, and they thought that the Christ had to come through the line of David and come through Bethlehem. So they obviously were unaware of the whole story that we obviously know. Others thought he was a moral man, a spellbinding teacher, but really nothing else. They had seen him in the past answer the religious leaders' charges. They had seen Jesus verbally cut these pious men down to size in a way that they probably secretly all wished that they could do. But somehow Jesus was able to get away with it. He never did say anything untrue, didn't say anything belittling. He just spoke the truth in such an authoritative way that left the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the teachers of the law speechless. Now, little did the crowd know that on that day, in just a few minutes, they were once again going to witness Jesus outwit the religious leaders, as well as forgive a woman caught in a very compromising situation. Now, yes, what this woman was accused of was a sin, but let's imagine this from her point of view. She's engaged in the most intimate act, and in just a second, she hears something like, "On your feet, woman, we're going to make an example out of you." And a million thoughts must have run through her mind. How long have these men been outside the door? Was this a trap? Her sinfulness was exposed, and so was she. She knew what her future held. She may not have been the most religious woman in Jerusalem, but most likely she knew that the law of Moses, which in a couple of places, Leviticus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 22:22, that the law of Moses stated that an adulterer and adulteress must be put to death. The men who invaded her private quarters were experts in this law. She'd probably seen them many times in the marketplace as they squabbled back and forth over those finer points of the scriptures, and so she knew that her Hebrew goose was cooked. Now, one of the first questions you might ask yourself is, where's the man? Even back in Bible times, it took two to tango. So what happened? Did he flee the scene? Did he leave the woman to take the punishment? Or was this that good old boy system in effect, even back in the first century Palestine? Was this man a Pharisee? Maybe he was one of the elite, and he was let off with just a wink. We don't know these details, but whatever the case, the man who was just as guilty as the woman was not presented to Jesus. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law now think they have a situation that Jesus cannot talk his way out of. They asked him, what should we do with this woman? Every good Hebrew boy knew the consequences of this kind of sin. It was death. So if Jesus replied to let the woman go, they would accuse Jesus of breaking the law of Moses. But if Jesus said, you should stone her, then they would accuse Jesus of breaking the Roman law, which stated that only Romans could exact capital punishment. The religious leaders were pretty much unified on the matter of Jesus of Nazareth. As a whole, the religious leaders didn't like this uneducated Galilean. He opposed them. He's called them hypocrites. He's challenged them on how they interpreted the law of Moses. But they thought today was going to be different. Today, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law had cooked up this scheme that was going to once and for all expose this carpenter's son for whom they thought was really a fraud. They tried trapping him before, but somehow he talked his way out. But today is going to be different. They devised this situation that Jesus couldn't talk his way out of. And little did they know that on this day, their own sinfulness would be exposed. And the one whose sin they sought to expose would be freed. Now, her name is not known. We only know her as the woman caught in adultery. We don't know if she was caught in a one-time act of passion, or is this her business? We don't know that. All we know is that she was caught in the act, and therefore she was guilty. Guilty of sin is what we say today. Well, we continue on in John chapter 8, 6b, which is the last half of verse 6 through verse 9. And as usual, Jesus did not respond with a direct answer. And that's what was frustrating to the Pharisees. They'd ask Jesus a point-blank question, and he would somehow answer it either with another question or some statement that would leave the leaders speechless. But today, he had a different reply. Today, he was silent. And he bent down and began writing on the ground with his finger. So what was he writing? Was he writing the Ten Commandments? The summation of the law, just as God had wrote on those 2 tablets over 1,500 years before this time? Possibly. He could have done this to remind the crowd that adultery is only one of the 10 Commandments. Or did he write the specific sins of those in the crowd? A visual reminder to those in the crowd that none of them were perfect. Possibly. When he did say something, he stood up and said for the one who was sinless to throw that first stone. Then he bent down and returned to his writing. And if we listen closely, I think we can hear the sound of those stones as they were clutched so tightly in their hands, ready to be hurled at this woman, hit the dirt one by one. First, the older men dropped their stones and their accusations, and they left, and then the younger ones. No one was left but Jesus and the woman. Then the last 2 verses of our text is in verses 10 and 11 in John chapter 8. Jesus stood and asked her, "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" And "No," she replied. This is where Jesus gave her hope. "Then I don't condemn you either." But it was followed by a command. "Go and leave your life of sin." So is what this woman did a sin? Well, yes. Did this woman deserve the punishment according to the law? Yes. Did she deserve to be stoned? Yes. But Jesus chose to be her friend, to forgive her, and to save her from this punishment. So here we see the balance of truth and grace. The Pharisees were the truth-only crowd. The rules say she must die. Stone her. But on the other extreme are those grace-only folks. You probably know some in both camps, right? The grace-only folks, if they had been there, they would have probably patted her on the head and said, "Don't worry about the affair, dear. God understands." You see, Jesus could have either said, "You must die for your sins," or "It's okay, you're free. Just follow your heart." Instead, he answered with, "I don't condemn you. Go." That's grace. And sin no more. That's truth. He didn't deny the truth, he affirmed it. He didn't deny grace, he offered it. When we overemphasize truth, we see no hope for salvation. Those people, they're too far gone. When we overemphasize grace, we see no need for salvation. Everyone's okay with God. Remember this thought. Truth hates sin, and grace loves sinners. And no one did both like Jesus. And just like he did in this story, Jesus offers grace and forgiveness today. Forgiveness may be free for the asking, but it isn't cheap. No, the sins you and I commit have to be paid for, and they have been. Jesus paid that sin debt for us, and we are to offer that same grace, that same forgiveness to others as we journey through life. No, it's not easy, and it's not natural. In fact, it's supernatural. The ability to extend grace and forgiveness like Jesus did, to do that to other people who are in our lives, That comes from within. That comes from what Christ has done for us. Well, my wife and I are going to be traveling to Clemson, South Carolina this week to visit our daughter and her family, so I might be able to talk those grandsons of ours into helping me with next week's video. As we continue in John, we're going to be looking next week in John chapter 9 about the healing of the man born blind. So don't forget, pray for and with your class. Thank you guys so much for watching.